All right, so welcome everybody. This is the next in our series of community conversations. Today's subject is a really good one and a really important one. Not that the others aren't, but we're going to talk about data quality, AI, and you. And the gesture is really important. Um, Certainly, I mean, you can't go 5 feet in an office, it seems, before somebody wants to talk about AI. And so at this point, I think there's some fairly good recognition, at least from those who have played with AI at all, that it really boils down to the quality of what you're going to get out from it depends on the quality that you have to put into it. Um, that's not a new concept. If anybody's been computing ever, the whole GIGO thing, garbage in, garbage out, is a long, well-established principle. But there's new overtones to it, I think, in the era of AI, and there's a lot that's been going on lately that keeps bringing it to the forefront. So, one of the more recent things was the furor caused when China came out and said, "Oh, we have DeepSeek," and everybody went nuts, and the stock market was affected, and all these things. And Jesse, we'll do introductions in a second, had mentioned that apparently the data that's going into DeepSeek is making its way to China with the same people who brought us TikTok. So that's a whole different dimension beyond just quality, but there's a whole ethical thing. Anyway, we got a lot to talk about. Um, we're going to talk about how like with the whole notion of garbage in, garbage out, we've been through this before with various technologies. So there's also a cautionary tale here that says, let's not get all excited. We're going to talk through what we're talking about when we're even talking about AI. What do we really mean? Go through some examples. What do we mean by quality? Because there's a lot of different ways to define that. And then, if I can ever shut up, we'll we'll conclude with, well, what do you do about it? What should we consider? So let me back up half a step because I get excited, and we'll go through introductions. I am Steve Weissman, the InfoGov guy at Holly Group. It's my turn to play MC. And this, as I mentioned, is a really great and relevant topic. It happens to be one of my favorites. And we've got some amazing people on the line here. My co-leaders, Jesse Wilkins, Donda Young, and a cast of many who are trickling in as we speak. So, Jesse, why don't we start with you? Tell the good folks who you are and why you're here, and then Donda, and then we'll start.
Sure. My name is Jesse Wilkins. I'm the president of Gathro Consulting, information governance consulting firm, and I also do a lot of training and certification related work. And I'm here because, like I think you and the rest of the people on the call, a lot of my clients are asking questions about this. A lot of my clients want to do AI, and sometimes they even have an idea of what they want to do with it. And I think we're at an interesting turning point in the sense that we have been rolling the rock uphill for information quality and data quality for years and years and years, and it turns out that that's kind of important if you want to do good AI effectively and ethically. So that's me. Donna?
Yeah, so hi everyone, Donda Young, independent consultant, much like my two co-hosts for Helios Consulting. Yeah, I think for me, this topic is super important around the data quality. Because for me, AI is just another piece of tech that information management, InfoGov, records management professionals have to pay attention to. And like my co-host, this event is for us to share, but it's also for you all to share your horror stories or your successes, questions, comments, concerns, just to get them out there. And, we may not have all the answers, but someone else on the call might. So that's why we like to say sharing is caring.
Mhm.
And I encourage you all to participate and not just listen to the three talking heads that are, hosting this event, because the community is where the knowledge is. It's not all in one person's or three people's, the host's brains, if you will.
Yes, 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 yes. And if you're too shy, then that's fine to be off camera, but we also encourage you to be on camera just because it makes it more fun and interesting. And of course, there is the chat function, which we'll be peeking at from time to time. Actually, that's a lie. Jesse's on it all the time, and I get too excited in what we're talking about, so I forget. So anyway, this is for you. It's not really for us. So, with all that said, um, what are we talking about? Let's, basics. What are we talking about when we're talking about AI? The common perception when you say the word AI in impolite company, it's the robots that are going to take over the world. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? In fact, that's not what we're talking about. And I think that's in our context as information people, that's irrelevant. So one of the first things I tell when I'm working with my clients is let's not worry about that so much. Let's pay attention to what it is we're trying to do, what the business problems are we're trying to solve, and stick to the basics. So for me, what I find is very often there's this conflation of AI and machine learning, and they're different. I don't consider them to be the same thing at all. And boils down to the difference between self-learning and self-teaching. Um, we'll talk. We'll go through our little panel here, and curious to hear what you guys think about it as well. But when I think of AI, I think of a technology that can make its own connections logically. It hasn't been taught anything from the outside. We don't have to feed it patterns to recognize or keywords to look for, or what have you. And that's not to say that machine learning isn't good. It is. It's amazing. I mean, if there's a technology that's been made for auto classification, that's it. But I don't think that's actually AI. And I'm going to endeavor to share something that I cribbed off the internet very, very quickly here because it sums it up just so well. So this is actually from several years ago, but you know how we say as parents, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you? Machine learning would say yes, because that's what the algorithm is. That's what the pattern is we're looking to optimize. Whereas artificial intelligence theoretically would say, no, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to jump off that bridge. So I offer that up as a poster for somebody to make if they're having this discussion where they live. All right, enough about me. Donda, why don't you chime in, take pot shots at what I've just said, and then Jesse, you can shoot at us both or anybody else.
Yeah, I wouldn't say any pot shots, really. I mean, I think we all have a different perception of what AI does, machine learning, all the newest and latest, greatest things. And I think it's important for us to recognize the fact that this is just another piece of tech that's getting thrown into the mix, just like all the Microsoft tools. They don't deploy SharePoint in the most favorable way for organizations, and that's not a dig on Microsoft at all. It's just the organizations, oh, we've got a new tool, let's just throw it at people and let's just put our stuff in it. Well, AI is kind of the same thing. You have to understand what you have. What is it trying to do first and foremost? And what are the anticipated outputs from that tool that you want to get out of it? And to be able to get quality outputs, you have to have quality inputs, which is your data, whether that's structured or unstructured. Jesse?
Yeah, the way I look at AI and AI, as we talked about on one of our prep calls, is that in many ways today, what we're calling AI, and specifically what we're calling generative AI, which is the darling of the day, it's math, right? It's probabilities, it's probabilistic. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, so much of AI generated writing is really not that good, because there's lots of really not that good writers out there, and they produce lots and lots of stuff, and off it goes to then be sucked back into the engine. And in fact, our erstwhile host coined a term for this a little while ago called ruminative AI, where we're using AI to generate things that we then train AI on, and it's a race to the bottom. Um, in thinking about this, I was actually doing a little bit of a thought experiment, and there are ways you can look up the greatest sentences ever written in literature, and I use that to find what I would call literature unique sentences. And this is an Amazon term I recall, and it's how you test for plagiarism. And
Huh.
those sentences were written by humans, and you can tell, right? As opposed to the pablum that gets spit out by most AI. So I think there are a lot of good things that AI can be used for, summarizing, outlining, note taking, and all of the machine learning things that Steve alluded to. Um, I think the jury is still out a little bit in terms of its AI as AI's overall usefulness, and again, in the quotes, because I just don't think we're there yet. And I think the probabilistic stuff means it's going to always be a race to the bottom, at least till we figure out a different way to do it.
One of the things you had mentioned, Jesse, when we were setting all this up, to your point about it, AI currently being it's essentially probabilistic. I can't even say the word, but we were talking about things like using it in retail or other environments for demand forecasting or inventory management. It's really souped up data analytics combined with the machine learning and say, well, what's the percentage likelihood that this is the right answer or a realistic answer? And then we talked about other kinds of environments. Again, we're not talking about the robot stuff. Um, so I'll pose your comment back as a question. Is a chatbot AI, Jesse? Since it was
I'm
your fault.
contemplating.
Okay. Well, go
You,
just
you
so
can
we know.
you can't quite smell the smoke from where you're at, but um, again, I think 90% of chatbots today, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail shortly, I know, but again, I think it's mostly pattern recognition. And so if you have a chatbot and you're trying to check your balance, reset your password, do things that there's a well-established process for, that you can point the chatbot at a sequence of steps and have it do the thing, look it up. I mean, in great extent, that's what we're talking about with RPA these days, right? And I increasingly see RPA and AI, and RPA is made intelligent with AI, and we're still following a pattern. We're still following a sequence of steps that a human has defined. And I don't know that I'm ready yet to follow the steps that AI defines, because I remember, and I've talked about this in my household, and this is the example we came up with, and maybe we did on our call too, where you're following assiduously the driving directions that Siri is giving you, and it tells you turn left, and there's no left there to turn onto, and so you find yourself in oncoming traffic. So no, I think chatbots are good and interesting and dangerous and problematic sometimes, but I don't know today that I would call them AI.
And first, kudos on using a word like assiduously. That, that's a lot of syllables. Um, but to your point, I mean that's a great segue into, well, what do we mean by quality? So in the scenarios you were just talking about with the chatbots, the quality might be okay and it might not be, depending how much information you've given it when you ask your question. Is it a pattern it can recognize? And then the information it has to draw on, can it make a match there and come up with a reasonable sounding answer? So then we get into, you know, we've all heard about AI and its tendency to hallucinate, and maybe getting better in some contexts, but it can make stuff up. And to me, that's very much a reflection of the quality, not only of the AI bot, but also the human using it, who just takes it at face value. But there's lots of other things that go into quality, just raw accuracy. There's timeliness is the information it's drawing from current, that sort of thing. There's consistency. And Donda, when we set this up, I'll go to you next. You talk about how it's so foundational to get that right. And since it is essentially a massive exercise in finding stuff to come up with answers, you were talking about how critical it is that you get your metadata and your tagging right. So maybe we
Yeah,
talk about
it's
that for a minute.
yeah, certainly. So so yeah, to set the stage of what do we mean by quality, and I'd say it's kind of I'll take it back or take it up, however you want to interpret that, but it's getting your data ready. So getting AI ready. What does that really mean? Getting it ready. So we've heard the diversity term. Make sure that you're feeding your AIs lots of stuff to reduce the bias. You don't want it to be such a narrow data set that it's always going to pinpoint this particular type of thing. And we've seen that happen in real estate, for example, where the bias has been against a particular type of minority group, for example. Quality is also timeliness. Like, I'll use the analogy. It's like pulling that stuff from the garden. You want the fresh stuff, right? You don't want the stuff that's been sitting around for decades. So to keep your models current, why not pull the most fresh data that you have to stay current? And then it's going to hopefully adapt to any particular changing conditions that you have out there, because you want those best outputs. For our records managers that are either on the horn today or maybe listening back later, it comes back to that source of truth. Where is that source of truth information? It has to understand what the characteristics are of the information. Is it complete? Do we have redundancies? What format is it in? And where to find the stuff, Obviously, there's always the quality of security and privacy. You can't forget those things when it comes to the data going in and the outputs coming out. You want to make sure that no one can get inside your models either. So, but I'd have to say the last two I'd say is like sharing is caring. I know that may sound kind of strange and odd in this scenario, but make your data accessible and make sure that it's discoverable to train the models. And maybe it's not just AI, maybe it is just regular old machine learning, pattern recognition, etc. But your metadata is a key component of that. You've got technical metadata, you've got your business metadata, context, findability. All of those things are things that are like foundational to finding regular old paper when you're doing scanning and indexing. Those principles haven't changed. You still have to have metadata to find your stuff and give it context for a better understanding within the AI models. And then, I was writing this up today for this very specific conversation around the being able to consume it. So my analogy is in like pulling staples, binder clips, smoothing out the wrinkles of your paper. Consumable data is making sure that the data is easily consumed, ingested, and in formats for the AI to learn from. So data, regardless of format, structured, unstructured, used to train the AI models is like traditional document scanning principles, to me, at least. It has to be clean. It has to be organized. You have to prep the stuff. before you push it into a machine, capture it, right? And you want that quality image after you scan it. Well, for AI, you want the quality outputs from the data that you're feeding it. It's kind of the same thing. And you can't forget that you have to give it context and metadata and all of these things that I've just talked about, because it's kind of foundational to what we've been doing. It's just, again, it's just another piece of tech on top. That's
Yeah,
my
no,
spiel.
if I nodded any more vigorously, my head would fall off. That's one way to get views. But so what, just to sort of put a bow on it, one of the things I heard you say is, I like the garden analogy. So, AI is compost, or can be, or could produce compost, and you don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Walter, you were looking for turns of phrases maybe to use in your upcoming meeting, so maybe there's one. We've got ruminant AI, we've got compost. Um, but Donna, you were also saying, sort of between the lines, a big part of this to ensure the quality, you're not one and done. Even if you do the one, which you have to do, and we've been doing, as you, I think, correctly point out, it has to be an ongoing thing, because the pile of content or data or information, the stuff, whatever you want to call it, that it's drawing on is going to continue to change.
Yes, it
And
is.
the business
Absolutely.
is going to change, so your queries are going to change. And so you really, as humans, we still have to be very actively engaged in really curating the pile of stuff that we're going to feed into AI.
And who better else than the people that have been so engrossed in managing records and information to be a part of that culture of AI, because they know where the body's buried, as I like to say. We
Yeah,
know where the information is within our organizations for the most part. Sometimes we know that new tech comes in and we don't get involved and we find out after the fact. But we generally know where this stuff is. And we can help the people that are trying to implement AI in an organization to make sure that they're getting the right source of truth information and that it's accurate.
right. And exactly that point. And Jesse, have you weigh in a minute, because I can see your brow furrowing in a positive way. Yes, very Mr. Bond. Um, what you just outlined there too, Donda, is how critical it is that there be communication between the structured and the unstructured people. I mean, we talk about data governance as a thing on the IT side. And sir, I spent a lot of time talking about information governance. The key phrase there is the governance piece. Considering that AI very often is being driven, certainly on the implementation side, by IT, having those two sides sort of lock arms and go after it is really critical. And I still see too much of a disconnect. It's changing, but too slowly for
Mhm.
my taste. Um, Jesse, what'd you come up with? Your genuine
Well,
intelligence engine.
well, I don't know about that, but I'm going to take what I just heard in and see if I can avoid putting out uh, compost, let us say. So that may be in the ear of the beholder, as it were. Um, for me, the interesting thing is that as much as we do with manipulating the stuff and the structure and the unstructured, and the governance and the quality and the metadata and the tagging, and all those things, at the end of the day, especially with generative AI, what we're talking about is a probabilistic engine. And so what that means is that it's going to try and answer the questions you pose to it and accomplish the tasks that that you want it to do. And if it can't do them, it makes stuff up. It makes compost up. And so I have a couple of examples here, but you can't, you know, do a search on the internet without finding a case every week of lawyers being sanctioned because they put stuff into an engine and it spat out case citations that didn't exist. And if they did exist, they were completely irrelevant. I linked one in the chat This is about a case against Walmart. But again, every week, if you look at eDiscovery Today, if you look at Association of Corporate Counsels newsletter, any of these sort of legal technology resources, every week there's multiple new ones. The lawyers are getting sanctioned, and you would think a couple of years into this process, lawyers would have figured out that human in the loop is not just the law, it's a really smart thing to do. Yet here we are. I think the other thing that's interesting is that, back to your question about chatbots earlier, I saw a story recently about this happened in Canada, I believe in British Columbia, and a man had need of a bereavement fair, and he went to the website and asked the chatbot, do I have to get the bereavement fair now because I can't figure out how to do it, or can I just get a refund of the difference later? And the chatbot said, "Oh yeah, you're good. Do what you do." He did the thing. He bought the tickets. He went to file for the bereavement fare, and the airline was, as is clearly displayed in our bereavement policy, you must select the bereavement fare. You cannot get it refunded for any circumstance whatsoever. And I have a link to that one too. And the guy fought it, and he won. And he won because at one point the airline said, well, the chatbot is a completely separate legal entity. That's not our stuff. We just built a little iframe on the website for it to appear in. And the court is like, under what circumstances is what appears on your website not your responsibility? So in this case, the chatbot didn't know or wasn't connected to or hadn't been trained on the actual bereavement policy, and hadn't been trained that when somebody said bereavement, it should either go look at that or hand it off to a human. And so there are lots of moving parts here, but I think they all kind of sum up to, we got to have humans in the loop, because no matter how good the quality of the data is, the engines are not, and probably never will be, perfect, because ultimately they're trained on either writings and processes by humans who are not perfect, or they're trained on their own effluvia, and that's a race to the bottom.
Wow. Effluvia. That's two SAT words right there.
I'm sorry I'm loopy because I had blood work done today.
Yeah,
So
no, I
I
like
don't
it.
have as much blood in my brain
No
as
blood
that.
sugar, Jesse.
You know, just real quick, we don't even have to be talking about AI to be talking about things like that. And I guess to link what we're talking about today and that story, under the heading of consistency, there's a great example of another form of it, because it wasn't consistent between the chatbot and the website. But I'm also reminded, just in terms of our roles and critical considerations we'll get to. Figure we'll leave at least 15 minutes for that towards the end. But one of those things, I know a person who got a letter from their healthcare provider saying in the letter that their coverage was going to end at such and such a date, and you should call this phone number or whatever. Problem is, the letter came after that date, and you say, well, you could blame the mail for that. The letter was produced and dated after that date. The date as listed in the letter was correct. The system worked fine because it put a date on the letter and got the thing in the mail. That was good. But it wasn't. So, like with the chatbot thing, it worked, except it didn't. So, talking about, data quality and curation and the need for humans, it shouldn't be a new concept. And I dare say none of us on this podcast right now are surprised by this. But there are plenty that don't make if you pardon the pun, don't make that connection. You push the button. Well, the computer said so. It's like, well, who told it to? Where is it getting that answer from? So as I, touched on very quickly at the outset, none of this is new. Donda, you brought that up too. It's another tool. Jesse, I agree completely. It's just math. It's just probability. None of it's new. So it's not going to take over our lives. In fact, it's a great opportunity, as we all have nodded about already, for those of us who do the information things to lead the charge. And not doing it is likely to cause you more trouble than actually doing it. Okay, so we talk about the need to have good quality data to feed in. So the next logical question is, it occurred to the three of us was, okay, well, define good. How good is good enough? Are we talking about perfection? Is that unrealistic?
Yes.
Okay, you answered first. You buzzed in first.
I,
Please
as
elaborate.
Jesse mentioned earlier, the information that gets created is created by humans. We're all flawed, so it's not going to be perfect. So don't
Speak for
aim
yourself.
for 100%. Aim for 75, and work your way towards 100. Are you ever going to get to 100? Probably not. But I think one of the biggest messages that I would say to the audience comes back to a pretty foundational aspect of what you do in projects. And we talked about this on our last call around scanning. It's about diversity and people in the room having the conversation. It's not just IT. It's not just legal. It's not just information management professionals. It's a collective group of individuals that have the knowledge within an organization to have these conversations and set up a project like AI implementation to do it right. And you can have those conversations. Hey, we're trying to figure out, from a probability perspective, how many women will purchase a Michael Kors purse. I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out. Well, if you know where that data is, then you can feed that information in so you get those probabilities and those outputs. But if the group you're including in your project isn't the right individuals to get to the right answers, what are you going to get? Garbage out?
Jesse?
Yeah, I think the way I would tie that together and respond to that is that quality also depends on what you're trying to do and how critical that level of quality is, right? And I think Don alluded to this a little bit, but I'm thinking the right people in the room depend on what you're trying to accomplish. I got the chance to do a fairly long and complex series of projects with a retailer, and with retailer, customer data is king, right? And so part of the question is they're starting to think about, they're always thinking about data quality, but as they start to think about how can they leverage that to do personalized marketing, how can they leverage that to do personalized offers based on everything from purchase history to credit score to every other little piece of data that they had access to, it became this question of, okay, well, we know we need marketing in the room. We know we need the data people in the room. Do we need privacy in the room? Yes. You needed privacy in the room for that particular discussion. Now, if they're talking about changing the way the website works, depending on how the website works means, maybe privacy is less important to be in the room for that particular initiative. But I think it's getting the right people in the room for what you're trying to accomplish and then asking them, what does data quality mean? And how is this going to impact the quality of our stuff and accuracy of our stuff? How is that going to impact the outcomes of what it is you're trying to do?
Yeah, and I'll take it both a step further. and also a circle back of a sort, if that doesn't break anybody's brain. Because that leads then to, well, how good is, what is good enough good enough? And it comes back to, well, what are you trying to accomplish? I'm one who believes, even though I said, we're searching for perfection. Yeah, I used the word perfection first. I don't believe that should be anybody's goal. So a big part of this, working with the people in the room, is to set what is an appropriate threshold to declare success. Because you get to a point. I mean, I've done enough, information maturity modeling to know, as many have. You after a certain point, you hit diminishing returns. Could we do better? Probably. Is it going to be worth the investment in time, people, technology? Maybe not. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to thinking about AI in general and how to make it perform in ways that we all kind of expect. And that in turn is tied to the quality of the stuff we're feeding it. I mean, someday maybe I'll draw this out as sort of a chain, a series of unfortunate events, because you got to work backwards kind of from what you're trying to accomplish and what's required to get there. And it's, what do people know? What are the technologies able to do? How do we make the technologies, blah, blah, blah. And it all comes back to fundamentally the GIGO thing, garbage in, garbage out. So I was involved with a project once. It wasn't specific to AI, but it had to do with credit card fraud. We were working with one of the big credit card companies. And it took a little while to kind of prod them off we want zero fraud as a goal, because that's not realistic. And if they threw enough money at it, oh, maybe they could get close to it. So I finally was able to flip the conversation on its head and say, what's your level of fraud right now? And I don't remember this specific number, and even if I did, I probably shouldn't tell you, but let's say it was, 20%. That's a lot of money represented there because of the volume. So what if we could cut that down to 15? What's that save you? So now they're not going for, zero fraud. They're going for less than they have now. And I think that's so critical. So whether you're, plotting something on the back of an envelope or actually, God forbid, already underway to try to do something, you really have to take a look at the context, because good enough is very often good enough. And as we talked about, you're not doing this just one and done. You can go back later and see how you did and where to make changes. In a maturity model context, there's no like one score. I mean, ultimately we boil it down to one score, but that score is made up of a lot of components, and you may be at a level 4 out of 5 over here, but a level half over here. So your average score is okay, but feet in the oven, head in the refrigerator doesn't mean you're comfortable. There you go.
I had never heard that analogy before.
There you go. No extra charge. And Jesse, as you pointed out during one of our prior conversations, you can't even think about getting to level 3 or 4 if you haven't gotten to level 2 yet.
Well, it's the crawl, walk, fly thing, right? It's, all of us who are now learning about AI, if you don't understand what goes into AI, and I don't mean all the technical bits of it, but if you don't understand conceptually what it is and what it's trying to do, if you don't understand all the things that you and Nan have talked about earlier in terms of how to make it do those sorts of things, then having a discussion with you about retrieval augmented generation, it's so far past the point that you don't even see it as it whizzes past, right? And so I think we have to start, as I've heard from somebody once or twice, start small, think big. Is that the right phrase?
Start small, grow big.
Grow big. That's it.
Yeah.
And so, when I do maturity assessments, as you say, they're 4 over here and they're a half over here. don't spend the time trying to go from 4 to 5. You're probably much better off, both in terms of resources and in terms of impact, trying to get the half to a 1 or 2, right? And again, we don't try and get the half to a 4 or 5 either. You got to walk before you can fly.
Yeah, I would add just a little bit to that is, yeah, my motto is start small, grow big. It doesn't make sense to try to, as I affectionately like to say, shove the whole donut in your face versus eating the elephant because I like elephants. But it's really about doing that assessment. Yes, you want to grow in your maturity, but maybe you are at a level 2 or 3. Okay, great. But are there things within your 2 or 3 maturity level that you can improve upon to make your foundation even stronger? And I think that's where some folks may look at, oh, we're at a 2, so we need to get to a 3. How about let's making your 2 really, really, really strong, and then work up towards the other areas within 3 that make you even stronger. You know, it really starts at the foundation, just like a house. You can't just put it on a 2x4 stilt and expect it to stay up.
So 50 Shades of Two, in other words. All right, I want to pause just for a minute. Our esteemed co-participants here on the call have been suspiciously silent. Not only have you all turned your cameras off or not put them on, but I would love if you're comfortable to have you add to the conversation and unmute yourself and I want to encourage you to do that. It's fine if you don't. Walter, I know what a shy and retiring person you are.
Steve, I was surprised last week when I figured out that ISO is bringing out a best practice called risk management for AI. And this was really a surprise for me. Normally, I work for the Brazilian ISO committee, 14 years now, and I normally see that changes in technology, ISO takes a long time until they bring something out. And I was really surprised that for the first time they have something very fast. And Donda was writing here, what is your risk tolerance and threshold? And I really was amazed that ISO came up with that. And it seems that the community starts to really become afraid about the risk and the risk tolerance that you should have or you should be aware when we exactly. This is the standard. The community is becoming aware about the risks that are involved when we discuss and implement AI.
What amazed you about it? I mean, I was psyched to see it, and I haven't read it, but I thought it was a really positive sign that they did this. Now, for stuff like this, there were so many variables in terms of executing. I mean, just country by country. I'm always
I was amazed because normally I see that ISO takes longer to bring a standard out when we talk about new things. And this for me, it was the first time that the time frame between what was happening in the industry and that they positioned themselves was very shorter than normally.
Right. No, I get it. I was thinking that they did it at all, but you're talking about the speed with which, and thank you for putting the link in the chat. So everybody can go get a copy if they're so inclined. Jesse, you spend more time in these circles certainly than I do. Or Kurt, do you want to weigh in first, maybe?
Well, I appreciate everything you guys are saying, and Donna, your example about the Michael Kors bag. So it's got me thinking the prompt engineering, like what is this technology capable of, and the ability to sort of have a dialogue. So using that example and saying, combining not only the data, like what are the top three reasons why people buy a Michael Kors bag? What are the other three things that a person who buys a Michael Kors bag might do? What day of the year? You can combine it with all these things, and the more specific you get, and then looking at the headlines and wondering and interested in the thoughts you guys have and insights. We've got Elon Musk and Doge getting access to all of these government systems. And so, yeah, and now they're coming out with these interesting things like 837 people are on Social Security that are over 220 years of age. Literally, there's a press conference. So, is this just some prompt engineering where they're using AI and looking at these massive data sets, which you could easily do? So anyway, interested in your thoughts, but kind of, what is the practical application of these technologies and what are we unleashing? Because you can ask these type of questions, and where does that lead us?
Well, it's a tough one to answer and still not lose potentially half our audience politically, so I won't spend too much time there.
But we're definitely in interesting days where this can
Well, yeah. Interesting days. I like that. There's another good phrase to go with the others who identified. Well, I think like any other kind of technology, and thank you, Kurt. And if we don't get to our critical considerations, I think we're kind of getting to it now anyway. You can use any of these things for good or for evil, right? And you could say the same for a shovel. You can bang somebody in the face with it, or you can dig a hole, or maybe both, because after one, you need the other. I don't know. It is certainly well within the scope of capability for these tools. And going back to where we started, it's also not new. I mean, what you've described, what Doge did in that press conference, the result basically is business intelligence. We're talking about big data, and it's a phrase you don't hear as much as we used to, but that's what it is. None of it's new. The fundamental issue is, beyond even the quality of the data itself, is why are we doing it? What do we want to do with the results? In a business context or an organizational operational context, that's the word I'm looking for. It ought to be to better the organization, right? To further its goals. You want to make more money, you want to serve more people if you're a nonprofit in a different way than, or you're a government agency and you're taking care of your citizenry. But it comes down to, and a lot of the questions that are being asked around the Doge example, what are they basing that stat on? And who is it that's doing the work? What's inside the black box? In an AI context, that's one of the great open questions. And to Donda's point, the bias and all the rest of it, we don't really know how it works. We kind of know how it works. Even the data scientists don't really know how it works. That's my understanding. And the whole ethical piece, which we touched on earlier, I mean, it's all one big ball of wax. So I'll stop opining in just a second, promise. But, as I've often said, another bumper sticker, it's the thinking that's the work. We know how to get the tool to operate. It's the thinking about why, what are we hoping to get out of it? What's realistic? Who do we need to have involved?
And making sure that there's no bias in what your goals are trying to set either.
And you won't eliminate that 100% either, because we are humans. But, sorry, one other thing. You were talking about earlier, Donda, there's another twist too about not being too specific so you don't get too much bias. I was talking to somebody recently who was talking about small language models because the better you can curate your data, the better outputs you get. So if you have a very specific need, you can rig the language model to be small instead of large and packed full of all the goodness of terminology and metadata that you need. So there's lots of stuff embedded here. All right, I promised I'd be quiet. So
Well, to go back to that, I think actually that's a much more promising route to go down, is this idea of small language models and retrieval augmented generation that is very specific. Think about, for example, a doctor who has the tool to assist in diagnosis, and you feed in all the things. And I guess in medical um, environments, there's this thing called chasing the zebra. You hear hoofbeats, you hear a whinny, and it's probably statistically not a zebra. Sometimes it's a zebra. Most of the time it's a horse. And so especially young doctors get into this thing where they're diagnosing this uber rare thing that two people in the history of humanity have had, as opposed to the common cold, right? And I think that's an area where these very tightly generated language models, and they're very tightly generated with all of the medical information we have in the world, are going to do some amazing things in terms of improving diagnoses. Who knows, maybe it'll even improve physicians' handwriting for prescriptions. Back for 30 seconds to the point that both of you just made about the large data set question with the government. It's what's the data show, who's interpreting that data, and what's the story they think they're telling or trying to tell or are biased to tell, right? And because that's a political question in the news of late, there's lots of danger in getting too close to that in a venue like this. But I think for any use of the AI that we're talking about with these large data sets, who's telling the story, what's the data say, and who's interpreting that data are really, really important things to keep in mind, whether you agree or disagree, whichever side you're on. I'm a guy who kind of likes to go where the truth is, and the truth, just like everything else, can be somewhat relative according to who's shaping this story.
as we come towards the end, we've got 5 minutes by the clock, and this is awesome. And Kurt, thank you for that question, that comment. There are so many great resources to learn from. Other people, of course, any number of TED Talks or what have you. I did want to mention the book that I've just gone through. It may be one of my favorite pieces of sort of tech / social literature I've ever read. That's a little bit overblown, but Jesse, you inspired me with your vocabulary. And probably you guys are familiar with it. It's a book called Nexus, A Brief History of Information Networks from the Stone Age to AI. Came out last fall by Yuval Noah Harari. Thank you, Jesse, for keeping the chat going. It's a fascinating take, and it speaks in many ways to much of what we've talked about. And I encourage you to look at this book in particular, or look him up on the internet. It's first of all, he speaks like a human being, not like an academic. Not that an academic take on things is bad, but I'm a peasant. I need the small words. But he's kind of turned well, at least my thinking on its side a little bit to talk about AI and information and how we use information to kind of mimic real life and the pluses and minuses of that. So like he talks about map making, and you want to draw a border, you draw a straight line, but the border in real life probably isn't a straight line. So you want to get more granular. And he talks about, I don't remember now if it was a thought exercise but basically the theory is the best way to map something as accurately you can is to actually have it be a one-to-one scale. And now you're not even talking about the real landscape anymore. You're talking about the map of the landscape that happens to be the same size as the landscape. So what does that mean? So we can read the book or we can all wait for the movie. But I did want to mention that in particular because I found it really illuminating, especially as we were talking about, when we were setting up this particular conversation. And he talks about, the politics of it all going back to the year one and before, how nothing's really new in this regard, except now we have AI. So I'll leave that as my final comment. You guys want to weigh in on last words here? Hopefully not last words. Guys, see us on LinkedIn, send us emails.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think for the information management professionals that are on here, but then also will listen to the podcast later out on YouTube. I would say don't be complacent. I'm not just a records manager should not be in your vocabulary. What you have done traditionally can translate into this whole AI thing as well. You can be an absolute foundational resource for any AI initiatives coming into your organization. So get involved, read up. You don't have to know how all the small, large, all the modeling works. You don't have to know how to code. You have to know some of the basics. And a lot of those basics, quite honestly, are just foundational elements you've already learned. You just have to translate it. That's my spiel.
I'll vote for
And
you. Jesse?
yeah, my parting thought is, and I certainly did not come up with this, but I've heard it over and over and over again. AI is not going to take your job. People who can figure out how to use AI and leverage it to improve business outcomes for their organization are going to take your job.
All said. I need to learn to be short and sweet like you. This was really awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. To my cohorts, the lovely and talented Jesse Wilkins and Donda Young. We're here every month, so y'all come back now. You're here.
Thanks,
Hi,
everybody.
guys.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
See you.